Welcome, weary traveler, to the first chapter of a long journey through the forgotten histories of the lands between. You have found your way to Night's Embrace, where we walk slowly through the deepest mysteries of eldenring's lore, where every revelation unfolds like a half-remembered dream, and every truth carries the weight of ages long buried beneath golden light and shadow. Tonight we begin at the very beginning, before Marika's ascension, before the Golden Order's rigid laws, before the Erdtree cast its commanding glow across the realm. We venture into that primordial darkness where something far stranger than any god once held sway over all living things. This is the story of the Crucible, and why the truth about life before the Erdtree should terrify anyone who truly understands what was lost when order came to fracture the world. There are no heroes in this tale, no villains in the way we might recognize them. There is only the slow, inevitable transformation of something beautiful and terrible into something else entirely. So settle in, let the ambient darkness wrap around you like a familiar shroud, and let us descend together into the time when all life was one, and discover why that unity was perhaps the most frightening thing the lands between has ever known. Chapter 1. When the world was whole, before there was separation, before there was order, before there were distinct creatures walking distinct paths through a divided world, there was the Crucible, not the Erdtree as we know it now, that golden monument to hierarchy and control, but something far more ancient, far more alive, and infinitely more intimate with the very essence of what it means to breathe and grow and change. Picture, if you can, a time when the concept of species meant nothing, when the boundary between human and beast, between plant and animal, between earth and sky, existed only as whispered suggestions rather than iron laws. The Crucible was the primordial form of the Erdtree, but to call it merely a tree is to misunderstand everything. The Crucible was life itself in its most raw, most unfiltered form, terrifying in its honesty, beautiful in its endless becoming. In those distant days, when all life was blended together, beings could manifest the traits of any living thing. The ancient words tell us this truth with perfect clarity. It was once thought that all life was born from a single great tree, and in that beginning, boundaries dissolved as naturally as morning mist touches water. Imagine walking through a forest where you might encounter someone whose skin bloomed with scales mid-conversation, where horns could grow from human skulls, not as curse, but as crown, where a person might suddenly unfurl a tail or develop a throat that could breathe dragon fire, and these changes would be welcomed as gifts from the divine rather than feared as corruption. The old stories speak of horns that once grew on people as a signifier of the divine in ancient times, before being increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization advanced. Even feathered wings were once marks of grace, plumage that sprouted from human shoulders as naturally as flowers bloom in spring. These were not random changes, but expressions of something profound, that all forms of life were merely different faces worn by the same eternal spirit. The world itself pulsed with primordial gold, a substance close in nature to life itself, carrying a red warmth that spoke of blood and heartbeat, and the endless dance of essence through every living thing. This golden thread flowed through ancient weapons and armor, weaving connections that bound all beings in ways our fractured age can barely remember. Touch these artifacts even now, and you can still feel their faint warmth, the subtle pulse that echoes the rhythm of that lost unity. Some say that in those days, If you knew how to listen, you could hear the heartbeat of the world itself, synchronized with your own pulse, reminding you always that you were not separate from the cosmos, but merely one note in its infinite song. It is whispered that those who lived during the Crucible's reign never truly died, but simply flowed from one form to another, like water finding new vessels, consciousness itself as fluid as the morning tide. Even now, whispers of that age persist in unexpected places. The Miranda blossoms, scattered throughout our world, are called an ancient aspect of the Crucible, their petals holding memories of when they might have been human, or beast, or something altogether. These flowers bloom with otherworldly beauty, watching those who pass with eyes that remember when sight itself was shared between all living things, rather than trapped within lonely skulls. The closest we might come to understanding is in those moments when we forget ourselves entirely, when absorbed in beauty or overwhelmed by emotion, the walls of self dissolve completely. But in the Crucible age, that dissolution was not a rare gift, but the everyday truth of existence. Children would be born with traits that shifted as they grew, their forms flowing between possibilities, like music that changes key without ever losing its essential melody. Even today, traces surface unexpectedly. The budding horn appears on creatures that should bear no horns, described as perhaps a vestige of the primordial crucible. These rare bloomings remind us that the ancient unity was never destroyed, only sleeping beneath the surface of our ordered world, like an underground river that sometimes breaks through stone to taste sunlight once more. The ancient ruins of Ro still hold whispers of this paradise, their dark stones rising from earth, like dreams made solid. Explorers speak of chambers that seem to breathe with ancient life, waterways flowing without source, streams that climb toward invisible skies. These ruins remember a time when the entire world was a garden, where every flower might speak, every tree might wander in search of better soil, every stone might dream itself into new shapes under starlight. Deep in Ro's heart, some say, voices still echo, not in any language ever spoken, but in words that bypass the ear entirely, meaning flowing like warm honey directly into the soul. Perhaps this is only wind moving through ancient halls, carrying the accumulated dreams of countless centuries, whispering to those who dare listen, of a time when all consciousness was one vast, breathing meditation, and understanding flowed between minds like light through crystal, requiring no words, because everything was already known, already shared, already home. Chapter 2: The Knights of Living Unity. To understand how the Crucible's primordial unity faded into memory, we must examine those who served as its final guardians during the twilight years under Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. The Crucible Knights were living contradictions, warriors who served the early Golden Order while wielding power that would eventually be declared forbidden by the very masters they protected. Ordovis and Siluria, the two foremost among these knights, led contingents marked by the axe and tree respectively, their equipment telling a story that should make anyone who understands loss feel a deep, quiet ache. The armor they wore was not mere protection, but a vessel for something far more precious, what the old texts call ancient holy essence, a warmth that flowed from the Crucible's red gold heart and allowed them to remember, with their very flesh, what it meant to be truly alive. When these knights donned their armor, they were not simply preparing for battle, but wrapping themselves in the living memory of what the world had been. The metal itself carried the pulse of primordial life, growing warm against their skin, like the touch of a lover long departed. Each piece, breastplate, gauntlet, helm, whispered of a time when such divisions between self and armor, between warrior and weapon, between human and divine, were as meaningless as asking where the river ends and the sea begins. Their weapons carried even deeper secrets. Ordovic's great sword and Siluria's tree were not forged but grown, shaped by the same force that once made horns bloom from human skulls and wings unfurl from willing shoulders. Touch them, even now, centuries later, and some say you can feel the faint tremor of that ancient heartbeat, as if the weapons themselves still dream of the hands that once wielded them with perfect understanding. The aspects of the crucible, horns, tail, breath, were their sacred remembrances, ways of returning temporarily to the state where all life flowed together like streams converging into one vast, peaceful ocean. When a knight called upon these gifts, they were not casting spells, but allowing their body to remember its truest nature. Horns would grow for charging strikes, not as bestial corruption, but as divine crowning. Tails would manifest for sweeping attacks, each movement a prayer written in flesh. Throat pouches would swell with dragon fire, breath itself becoming an offering to the memory of unity. The old stories tell us that horns once grew on people as a signifier of the divine in ancient times, before being increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization advanced. What a weight of sorrow lives in those words. How completely the world forgot that these changes were blessings, marks of grace that showed the crucible's love flowing through willing vessels. The knights knew this truth in their bones, felt it in every transformation that reminded them of what had been lost. Even feathered wings could sprout from their shoulders, plumage that caught starlight and held it like captured dreams. Scales would bloom across their skin like silver poetry, each one a verse in the great song of becoming. These were not random gifts, but expressions of the infinite creativity that once flowed through all living things as naturally as blood through veins. But even in Godfrey's time, something essential was already changing. The crucible gauntlets speak of how in time the strength shown by these knights, and even their appearance, was seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. This was not a sudden turning, but a slow forgetting, like watching dawn fade into memory as night deepens. Each generation remembered a little less of what transformation truly meant, until what had once been worshipped as divine became feared as chaos. The knights themselves felt this change like a cold wind moving through their souls. Some say they grieved not for their own fading, but for a world that was choosing comfort over truth, choosing the safety of rigid forms over the terrible beauty of endless becoming. They were the last to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than individual will, to be notes in a symphony rather than isolated voices crying in darkness. As their power was slowly deemed unacceptable, whispers suggest the knights did not simply vanish, but withdrew to hidden places where the old ways could still be practiced. In the deepest ruins, where crucible energy flows like underground rivers, they are said to have created sanctuaries for those born with the ancient marks, horns, scales, feathers, offering refuge to souls that the changing world no longer recognized as blessed. The Knight Devonia, still standing guard in the ancient ruins of Ra, represents this eternal vigil. Motionless among the dark stones, they protect not just a place, but the memory itself, holding space for a truth too vast for the current age to contain. Some say that those who approach with proper reverence can still glimpse fragments of the old transformations, though such visions change the viewer forever, leaving them homesick for a home that exists now only in dreams. These guardians are said to practice meditations that allow consciousness to flow between forms like water, finding new channels, one moment scaled and ancient, the next feathered and weightless, always changing, yet always themselves. They wait in the deep places where time moves differently, where the boundaries between what was and what might be again grow thin as spider silk. The weapons they carried, Ordovis's blade, Siluria's living spear, still pulse with memory. Those brave enough to touch them speak of feeling an echo from that distant time when every battle was both destruction and creation, when steel sang not with violence, but with the deeper music of life, expressing its infinite potential through willing hands. In the deepest silence of forgotten halls, where dust motes dance like tiny spirits in shafts of amber light, these knights continue their patient watching, holding vigil for the day when the world might remember that transformation was never meant to be feared, but welcomed like the first warm breath of spring after winter's longest night. Chapter 3. Lords of Stone and Storm. Long before the Golden Order cast its rigid light across the lands between, before even the Crucible's unified song echoed through primordial halls, there ruled beings of such ancient majesty that their very existence feels like something half remembered from a dream. The ancient dragons were not merely creatures but living monuments to eternity itself, their bodies carved from stone and storm, their hearts beating with rhythms older than memory. Picture dragons whose flesh was not flesh at all, but stone touched by divine fire, grey rock shot through with veins of primordial gold that pulsed like captured starlight. Their scales were fragments of something precious beyond naming, each one holding the power to stretch moments into hours or fold years into the space of a single breath. When these magnificent beings finally stilled, the gold would fade from their stone flesh, leaving behind only cold rock, as if their divine nature was something borrowed from the heavens rather than born within their ancient bones. At the heart of this impossible realm stood Dragonlord Placidusax, a being so old that he served as Elden Lord in the age before the Erdtree, when the very word order meant something entirely different than the structures that would follow. His reign was not one of command, but of patient watching, a slow and careful tending of forces that slipped through modern understanding like water through fingers. Some say he possessed not one head, but 5, each facing a different horizon, while the 5th gazed into realms that exist beyond all seeing. These Lords of Stone did not simply rule. They were the living memory of creation itself, their bodies bearing the weight of countless ages, yet somehow untouched by the weariness that marks all lesser things. They move through the world like walking mountains, each step a meditation on the nature of permanence and change. This is why their remains became ancient dragon-smithing stones, materials that could reshape the very soul of weapons by whispering to them of eternity. In their floating temples of Faramazula, suspended in spaces where ordinary rules hold no sway, these ancient sovereigns presided over ceremonies that have no echo in our current age. The beastmen who served them were not subjects, but willing dancers in something far grander, a slow symphony where every roar, every gesture, every breath was part of a composition that spanned lifetimes. To serve a dragon was to serve something beyond individual desire, to become part of a song that transcended the brief flickering of mortal concerns. The dragons spoke, though not with voices as we know them. Instead, their words flowed through the deep bones of the earth, through resonances that made stones hum and metal sing soft lullabies. When an ancient dragon wished to communicate, the very ground would pulse with sympathetic rhythm, reality itself becoming a throat through which their thoughts could find expression. Each utterance was both word and deed, reshaping the world even as it described it, There are whispers that Placidus did not rule alone, but served as vessel for something even more ancient, a presence that breathes in the spaces between moments, that dreams in the pause between storm and stillness. This hidden mystery never showed itself directly, but worked through the dragons, using their mastery over the flow of days and seasons to weave patterns that would only become clear when viewed from the heights of forever. The end of their dominion was not marked by battle, but by something far more gentle and infinitely sadder, as new powers began to stir in the deep places of creation, as other eyes turned toward the lands between. The ancient dragons simply stepped aside, not in defeat, but in recognition that their season of guardianship was ending, that other hands would now guide the world's unfolding story. Placidusax withdrew beyond the reach of ordinary time, entering a state that was neither sleep nor waking, but something like the pause between one dream and the next. Even now, in the deepest chambers of Faramazula, where stone defies gravity and air shimmers with half-seen possibilities, some say the Dragonlord continues his vigil, not truly present in our fleeting moment, but existing in all moments simultaneously, watching with patient eyes for the turning of wheels that move too slowly for mortal hearts to follow. Their presence lingers in unexpected places, in the way certain storms carry voices from forgotten times, in how some stones grow warm without reason, in those rare moments when the world itself seems to pause and listen to music we cannot hear. They showed us that true strength lies not in conquest, but in understanding, not in forcing change, but in moving with the deeper currents that carry all things toward their destined shore. In the gathering dusk of memory, when the last light of understanding fades, and we are left with only fragments of their impossible reign, perhaps we can still sense their presence in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between breath and speech, in that eternal moment, when all of time holds its breath and remembers what it means to be truly, magnificently alive. Chapter 4. The One Great Fracturing. There is a story that few dare speak aloud, whispered only in the deepest places, where shadows gather like old friends sharing forbidden secrets. It is the story of what came before everything we think we know, before the greater will, before the ancient dragons, before even the Crucible's primordial song. It is the story of the One Great, and why its breaking apart might be the most profound tragedy ever to unfold across the vast tapestry of existence. In the beginning, if such a word has meaning when applied to something that encompassed all beginnings, there was unity so complete that the very concept of separation did not exist. The One Great was not a being, or a force, or even a presence, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. All that is, all that was, all that could ever be, flowed together in perfect, endless harmony. There were no individuals because there was no need for them. There was no loneliness because there was no self to be alone. There was no suffering because there was nothing outside the whole to cause pain. Imagine, if you can, a state where every thought was shared by all consciousness, where every feeling rippled through the totality of being like gentle waves on an infinite ocean, where love was not something exchanged between separate entities, but the very substance from which all existence was woven. This was not emptiness, but the most profound fullness imaginable, a completeness so vast that it contained every possible joy, every conceivable beauty, every dream that could ever be dreamed. But something went wrong, something that the mystic Hyeta, touched by the flame of madness and blessed with terrible clarity, describes as the greater will's great mistake. all that there is came from the one great. She tells us in words heavy with the weight of cosmic sorrow. Then came fractures, and births, and souls, but the greater will made a mistake. What was this mistake? What could possibly justify the shattering of perfect unity into countless fragments, each crying out in isolation for something they can barely remember losing? The greater will, in its alien wisdom, or perhaps in its alien folly, chose to divide what had always been whole. It took the one great and broke it apart like light passing through a prism, creating the rainbow of separate existence we now inhabit, beautiful perhaps, but forever incomplete. From that first fracturing came everything we know as reality, the birth of individual souls, each one a tiny fragment of the original wholeness, carrying within their deepest core a longing they can never quite name, the creation of space and time as containers for these newly separate beings to move within, the invention of death as the boundary that makes each life precious by making it finite. All of this arose from what had once been seamless, eternal, perfect unity. And with separation came suffering, not as punishment, but as inevitable consequence. For how could beings who were once part of an infinite whole not feel the ache of incompleteness? How could souls that had once shared everything not mourn the barriers that now divide mind from mind, heart from heart? Every pain we feel, every loneliness that hollows out our nights, every desperate reaching towards something we cannot name, all of it echoes back to that original sundering, that first wound carved into the heart of existence itself. Yet speaks of this with the clarity that only comes from having looked directly into the source of all torment. Lord of frenzied flame, she whispers, I can see it in the distance, the flame of frenzy. It burns, but her words carry more than madness. They carry a terrible understanding of what the frenzied flame truly represents, not destruction for its own sake, but a longing to return to the state before separation, before the mistake that broke the one great into countless aching pieces. The flame's ultimate desire is both terrifying and heartbreaking, until all is one again, not the creation of something new, but the restoration of what was lost when unity first cracked apart. It seeks to unmake the greater will's work, to dissolve the boundaries between self and other, to return all consciousness to the primordial state where suffering was impossible because there was no separate self to suffer. This is why the frenzied flame is so feared, not because it represents chaos or evil, but because it offers a solution so complete, so final, that it would erase not just pain, but the very possibility of individual existence. To accept its embrace would be to return to the one great, yes, but at the cost of every separate joy, every unique perspective, every small and precious act of individual will that has emerged from the fragments of that original whole. The tragedy lies not in the choice between order and chaos, but in the recognition that both paths carry their own forms of loss. The greater will's fragmented order gives us the gift of individual experience, but condemns us to eternal incompleteness. The frenzied flame's unity promises an end to suffering, but requires the dissolution of everything that makes us distinctly ourselves. Perhaps this is why the deepest wisdom traditions speak not of choosing one path or the other, but of finding ways to remember unity while honoring separation, to touch the one great without losing the precious fragments of self that we have become. In the quiet moments between sleep and waking, in the pause between one breath and the next, we might still glimpse what we truly are beneath all our beautiful, terrible divisions, echoes of something whole, learning slowly to sing together once again. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Ruins. Scattered across the lands, between like fragments of a half-remembered dream, the ancient ruins whisper stories of civilizations that flourished long before the Golden Order's first light touched the world. These are not mere archaeological curiosities, but living memories carved in stone, each one a window into ages when the fundamental nature of existence followed entirely different rules. To walk among these ruins is to move through a museum of lost possibilities, where every crumbling arch and weathered pillar speaks of ways of being that our current age can barely comprehend. The ancient ruins of Ro stand as perhaps the most haunting testament to this vanished world, rising from the earth in perfect octagonal patterns. Their dark stone architecture defies not just our understanding of construction, but our very concept of how structures should relate to the landscape around them. These are not buildings imposed upon the earth, but growths that emerged from it, as if the stone itself dreamed of reaching skyward, and simply, the builders of Ro understood something we have forgotten, that the boundary between living and unliving is far more fluid than our rigid categories suggest. Walk through Ro's corridors today, and you will find waterways that flow without source, channels that guide water upward, as if gravity were merely a gentle suggestion rather than an iron law. The very air shimmers with a quality that makes visitors speak in hushed tones, not from reverence alone, but from the sense that normal sound might shatter something precious and irreplaceable. This was described as an Edenic realm, and indeed it preserves the memory of when the impossible bloomed, as naturally as flowers seeking sunlight. The stones themselves tell stories of builders who worked with forces we no longer recognize, massive blocks fit together with precision that would challenge any modern craftsman, yet there are no tool marks, no signs of struggle against resistant material. Instead, the stones seem to have grown together like living tissue, each piece finding its perfect place through some form of gentle knowing rather than force. Some say that if you place your hand against these walls, you can still feel a faint warmth pulsing through the rock, as if the buildings themselves retain a form of slow, patient dreaming. Following the threads of mystery deeper into the earth, we find that Ro was not alone in its wonders. The underground chambers of the eternal cities reveal civilizations that chose to burrow deep rather than build high, creating vast spaces where artificial stars provided light that never dimmed or flickered. These subterranean dwellers understood that wisdom sometimes requires withdrawal from the surface world's constant changes, that preservation of ancient knowledge might mean literally going underground until hostile ages pass, like storms over a sheltered valley. Between earth and sky, suspended in spaces where ordinary rules hold no dominion, Farum Azula floats like a stone dream made manifest. This was not built by conventional means, but shaped by beings who understood that architecture could be an expression of will rather than mere engineering. The beastmen who once populated its halls moved through spaces that folded and unfolded according to principles we have lost. Their daily lives, a form of walking meditation that kept the very stones from falling into the void below. In the deepest places, where few dare venture, explorers report finding chambers that seem to breathe with their own rhythm, walls that pulse gently like the sides of some vast sleeping creature. These spaces are said to respond to the emotional state of visitors, growing warmer in the presence of wonder, cooling when approached with hostile intent. Such reports might be dismissed as fantasy, except they come from sources too varied and too consistent to ignore entirely. The builders of these lost ages created tools that worked in harmony rather than opposition. Water flowed upward, not because mechanisms compelled it, but because it was gently reminded of its connection to the sky. Stones joined together, not through binding agents, but through shared understanding of their role in the greater structure. Light emanated from crystals, not through harsh awakening, but through patient encouragement of their inherent luminescence, like coaxing songs from sleeping instruments. Perhaps most mysteriously, some ruins seem to exist partially outside the normal flow of days and seasons. Visitors report finding chambers where dust never settles, where organic materials show no signs of decay, where the very air tastes of mornings that happened centuries ago, yet somehow remain eternally fresh. These temporal havens suggest that the builders possessed not just deep understanding of physical forces, but some mastery over time itself, creating spaces where the past could be preserved, not as memory but as living present. Their technologies operated on principles of invitation rather than domination, of cooperation rather than conquest. They developed ways of living that honored the connections between all things, understanding that true abundance comes not from taking more than you need, but from needing less than the world freely offers. Their ruins speak of prosperity achieved through wisdom, wealth measured in understanding rather than accumulation. As we move through these silent halls and empty courtyards, we carry with us the weight of what has been lost. These were not primitive peoples waiting for advancement to find them, but sophisticated societies that chose different paths than the ones our current age has followed. They walked roads that led to harmony rather than dominion, creating beauty that grew from the earth rather than being imposed upon it. In the gathering twilight of memory, as shadows lengthen across weathered stones and night winds carry whispers of voices long stilled, these ruins serve as quiet reminders that the world has known other ways of being. They stand as patient teachers for any willing to learn that progress need not mean the abandonment of wisdom, that advancement might sometimes mean returning to truths we thought we had outgrown, that the future might hold possibilities as beautiful and strange as anything these ancient builders ever dreamed into stone. Chapter 6. The Last Vestige of Paradise. Even now, in our fractured age of rigid order and artificial boundaries, whispers of the primordial unity still break through the carefully constructed walls that separate one form of life from another. These are not grand manifestations or dramatic returns to ancient ways, but gentle reminders, soft as morning dew, subtle as the shift of seasons, that the Crucible's truth was never truly destroyed, only sleeping beneath the surface of our ordered world, waiting for moments when the barriers grow thin enough for memory to bleed through. Walk through any forest in the lands between, and you might encounter creatures bearing the budding horn, small protrusions that appear, perhaps as a vestige of the primordial crucible on beasts that should, by all current understanding, bear no horns at all. These are not mutations or aberrations, but gentle assertions of an older truth, that the categories we use to define and separate different forms of life are more fluid than we dare admit. Each budding horn is a small rebellion against the tyranny of fixed form, a whispered reminder that transformation was once as natural as breathing. The Miranda blossoms that dot the landscape carry within their delicate petals the memory of ages when the distinction between plant and animal, between flower and consciousness, held no meaning. Described as an ancient aspect of the crucible, these blooms seem to watch those who pass with a patience that speaks of vast vegetative understanding. Their otherworldly beauty hints at depths of awareness that our current philosophy cannot accommodate. What if these flowers remember when they might have been human, or when humans might have been flowers? in the endless dance of forms that once characterized all existence. In the deep places where crucible energy still flows like underground rivers, spirit calculus accumulates, crystalline formations that seem to hold fragments of living essence in suspended animation. These mysterious growths appear in areas where the old power runs strongest, as if the very air becomes dense with memory, solidifying into forms that bridge the gap between mineral and spirit. Touch one of these formations, and some say you can feel the echo of what it was like when consciousness itself was shared rather than isolated, when the boundary between self and world was as permeable as the surface of still water. The crucible incantations themselves persist, passed down through secretive lineages that remember what the mainstream world has chosen to forget. These are not mere spells, but acts of devotion, ways of temporarily dissolving the artificial barriers that keep us trapped in single forms. When a practitioner manifests the aspect of the crucible horns, they are not adding something foreign to their body, but allowing their flesh to remember its truest nature. The horns that grow are not bestial degradation, but divine crowning, each one a small return to the state where all possibilities exist simultaneously within every living being. Even the landscape itself carries traces of the ancient unity. In certain valleys, where the light falls just so, where the mist clings to ancient stones with particular tenderness, visitors report feeling a shift in the very nature of perception. The boundaries between observer and observed begin to soften. The rigid categories of self and other start to blur, and for brief moments, it becomes possible to experience the world as the crucible intended, not as a collection of separate objects to be catalogued and controlled, but as a single vast organism in which every part shares awareness with every other part. These manifestations are growing rarer as the world moves further from its primordial origins, as the Golden Order's influence spreads, and the memory of unity fades from living experience into distant legend. Yet they persist with stubborn grace, like wildflowers pushing through cracks in carefully laid stone, reminding us that no system of control, however comprehensive, can completely suppress the fundamental truth of existence. There are those who seek out these vestiges deliberately, pilgrims of a sort, who understand that the path back to paradise begins with recognizing the paradise that still exists in hidden corners of the present moment. They learn to see the budding horns not as anomalies, but as invitations, the Miranda blossoms not as mere plants, but as teachers, the spirit calculus not as curiosities, but as gateways to forms of consciousness our age has forgotten how to access. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the veil between worlds grows gossamer thin, these seekers practice the old remembrances. They sit in meditation beside ancient stones, allowing their awareness to soften and expand until the boundaries of individual selfhood begin to dissolve like salt in warm water. They learn to feel the slow pulse of tree consciousness, the patient dreaming of stones, the vast networked awareness that connects all growing things in webs of communication too subtle for ordinary perception to detect. The knowledge they recover is not academic, but experiential, a gradual return to ways of being that predate the artificial separation of mind from matter, self from world, human from nature. They discover that consciousness is not trapped within the skull, but flows like invisible water through all forms of life. That awareness is not the exclusive property of humans, but the fundamental nature of existence itself, temporarily focused through countless different lenses, but never truly divided. As our current age moves deeper into its own complexities and contradictions, these gentle manifestations of primordial truth become more precious than any treasure, more valuable than any knowledge. They are the seeds from which a future understanding might grow, the hidden roots that connect our fragmented present to possibilities we have not yet learned to imagine. In the deepest silence of night, when the world holds its breath between one moment and the next, we might still catch whispers of what we truly are, beneath all our beautiful divisions, fragments of the one great learning slowly to remember our common source, drops of water gradually recognizing their essential unity with the ocean from which they arose, and to which, in the fullness of time, they must inevitably return. As you settle deeper into the comfort of night, let these images drift through your mind, like smoke from dying embers, the memory of horns growing as crowns rather than curses, of consciousness flowing between all living things, like warm honey through crystal, of a time when loneliness was impossible because nothing was ever truly alone. Let the weight of these ancient truths sink into your bones, not as burden, but as blessing, a reminder that beneath all our beautiful divisions lies something whole, something patient, something that remembers what we have forgotten and waits gently for our return. We have walked with the Crucible Knights in their final vigil, stood in the shadow of ancient dragons, whose stone hearts beat with the rhythm of eternity, explored ruins that remember when paradise was not just possible, but present, breathing in every breeze and flowing through every stream. We have touched, however briefly, the edges of that vast mystery that preceded everything we think we know about order and separation, and the careful boundaries that define our current age. And so we come to the end of our first journey together, through the forgotten histories of the lands between, a gentle descent into the primordial age when all life was one, when transformation was blessing rather than curse, when the very stones dreamed of unity, and the air itself carried whispers of the one great ancient song. The fire beside you crackles with its own quiet wisdom, each spark a tiny echo of the primordial flame that once illuminated a world without shadows, without separation, without the ache of incompleteness that marks our current age. Let its warmth carry you towards sleep, toward dreams, where transformation is natural as breathing, where unity flows through every heartbeat, like the tide returning to embrace the shore. Until we meet again in the next chapter of this long journey, rest easy and dream of unity. Sleep well, weary traveler. Let the fireplace ambience wrap around you like the embrace of the crucible itself, and may your dreams remember what your waking mind has forgotten, that you are not separate from the vast tapestry of existence, but woven into its very heart, a note in the eternal song that began before time and will continue long after the last star fades to gentle darkness.